In the early days of the second Trump presidency, with a mission to deliver on campaign promises, President Trump's administration abolished a long-standing policy of not conducting immigration enforcement in protected spaces such as hospitals, churches, and schools. On this week's episode of Inside the Investigation, investigative reporters Kelly Wiley and Arezow Doost explain how federal and state changes are causing fear in the places where people are meant to feel the most safe. Hello, thank you for joining us. I'm Josh Hinkle. Welcome to this edition of Inside the Investigation. Today I am joined by your normal host, investigator Kelly Wiley, also investigator Arezow Doost. Thank you both for being with us so much.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Sure. So you've both been with our team digging into the impact of ramped up immigration enforcement in places like hospitals and schools. So I want to start with Kelly today. Explain why people are concerned about those places in particular.
Yeah, well, for over a decade, the Department of Homeland Security had a policy of ensuring immigration enforcement actions did not occur in or near what was called sensitive areas or protected spaces. And that would include schools, churches, hospitals. But shortly after President Donald Trump took office for the second time, that policy was rescinded. So a lot of that concern is coming from that.
Why is that?
Well, in a press release, the acting DHS secretary said the change would empower Border Patrol and ICE agents to enforce immigration laws. The statement said criminals would no longer be able to hide in America's schools and churches to avoid arrest. And he also said it would allow those agents to use, quote, common sense.
So a little later, we'll talk about the impact that that's having on hospitals. But Kelly, what was the response from school districts when you checked in all through Central Texas?
The words that kept coming up were fear and panic. Our digital data reporter, Christopher Adams, and I pulled data from the schools in Central Texas with the highest and lowest population of Hispanic students. And we found attendance dipped in the days after the policy change.
And of course, that could have been impacted by other factors, right?
Of course, yes. We noticed attendance dropped in districts with high Hispanic student rates, but not so much in those with low Hispanic populations. Like in Dripping Springs ISD, Eanes ISD, Lake Travis ISD, attendance stayed flat or even increased the day after the policy change. But in each of those districts, Hispanics make up less than a quarter of all students. In Eanes ISD, they make up only 15% of the student population. And we talked to teachers and counselors at Lemon High School, that's in Buda, where Hispanic students make up 80% of the student body. And they described getting calls from parents asking if it was safe to bring their kids to school.
Our immigrant population was scared. We had a lot of teachers have conversations with parents saying, well, we don't know if we want to send our kids. We had to quickly say, hey, that's not the case, or, we're not, I don't know that we could actually, that ICE could actually do that, or that they had the manpower to do that.
We also talked to Viridiana Carrizales. She has a really interesting background. She's now a naturalized citizen, but she was at one point an undocumented student herself. And she started a nonprofit in 2017 that helped undocumented students navigate their education. And she too said she was getting a lot of calls and texts from parents who wanted to withdraw their students over fear that something would happen while they were dropping them off.
This is one of the text messages that I have received. I wanted to ask you if you know of a school online that I can enroll my daughter. She's in 8th grade. With all that is happening right now with immigration, we're really afraid, and I want to take her out of school.
And I should clarify that dip in attendance lasted days. It didn't last months or weeks. It bounced back pretty quickly at those school districts. But they say that the fear that these educators and advocates describe, it's still there, and it's weighing on their students and families.
And have we seen ICE or Customs and Border Protection try to come into campus in Texas looking for information about undocumented students, or trying to even detain a student or a parent on campus?
Several times throughout our reporting, we did these blasts, these email blasts to school districts to ask them those very questions. And we reached out to every single one in Central Texas. None of them have reported that ICE has tried to seek information on a student or tried to come on campus since that policy was rescinded. There have been some peeks into what schools are experiencing. In February, leaders from Alice ISD in South Texas, they said they received information that Border Patrol agents might attempt to get on school buses at highway checkpoints. But later, the school district retracted that letter that they sent to parents. On an episode of Fox and Friends, U.S. Border Patrol Chief Mike Bank, he called the idea of agents targeting school buses absurd. But more recently, we learned a regional tactical strike team that's made up of DPS troopers and Homeland Security investigators stopped an undocumented couple just off of an Austin ISD campus. So not on campus, but very close to it. And according to the legal team that's representing that family, the couple had just dropped off their kids. That whole traffic stop interaction, it was over expired plates, according to DPS. And they said that the ICE told us that interaction led to the couple, their oldest child, who we also understand is undocumented, and their two youngest children who were born in the United States being detained by ICE and then very shortly after being sent to Mexico. DPS has not explained to us why they were operating so close to this campus in the first place.
Yeah, and you might be wondering why DPS was even involved, but that kind of goes back to earlier this year when Governor Abbott told the agency to start cooperating with ICE and form these regional tactical teams that do essentially when they make an arrest or a traffic stop or anything, they can call in the federal agents to kind of take over at that point.
Exactly.
So let's stay on that traffic stop for just a second. It turned to immigration enforcement for a second. I know that you asked DHS and ICE questions about this. What did they have to say?
DHS and ICE didn't really speak, again, to why they were near the school, but they say that they flagged the driver, the patriarch of this family, as someone who'd been convicted of crimes previously while in the U.S., and namely DUIs, and that he had been deported 3 other times before. We've heard it several times, Border Czar Tom Homan address this concept of U.S.-born children leaving the country as a result of their parents being deported. We have a clip of one of the times he's addressed that.
If you choose to have a U.S. citizen child, knowing you're in this country legally, you put yourself in that position. You put your family in that position.
So part of what you wanted to find out is whether school districts were being given any guidance. And what did you find when you asked around about that?
Well, a lot of school districts have passed resolutions or released guidance to the public, to their families, showing they do have a plan if there was some sort of an attempt of immigration enforcement on their campuses. AISD, for instance, said they would have their own legal department verify if the agency had a warrant and only grant them to do what the judge signed off on. But the Mexican American Legislative Caucus wanted the Texas Education Agency to provide guidance to all school districts.
Commissioner Morath, respond to our letter and let us know how you too are working to protect our Texas kids.
That was Representative Romero. He was really leading the effort along with Malk to get TEA to provide kind of one solid thing of guidance to all these school districts. Commissioner Mike Morath, he wrote back to Malk saying that school districts should, quote, follow the law. And he mentioned a couple of ways that he's talking about: maintaining secure facilities, not allowing visitors without a legitimate reason to be on campus. But Commissioner Morath also said campus personnel must not impede federal officers. It's worth noting that TEA says they did provide the same guidance that they sent to Malk to any school district that asked for guidance. But ultimately, school leaders say it's not just ICE coming onto campus that they're worried about. It's what kids are coming home to as well, and how this fear may be undermining their ability to learn and to pay attention when they're in class. Educators at Lemon told us they've already seen kids kind of be blindsided when their parent is detained and deported. They are also asking parents to kind of prepare for the worst case scenario, right? They're saying to leave 2 to 3 contacts of people other than yourself with the school district, so that if something happened off campus, I mean, maybe not even an interaction with ICE, that there's someone else that they can call that you trust to take care of your child rather than perhaps having to get CPS involved.
So you've been working with our digital data reporter, Christopher Adams, on this, and you all have some amazing interactives in your story. You can find that by clicking on the school and education button that is on kxan.com/undocumented. Christopher also worked with the other person who is joining us in just a little bit, Arezow Doost, on how this played out for hospitals and medical access. We're going to take a quick break, but when we get back, we will talk with Arezow about that part of this issue. Welcome back to Inside the Investigation. I'm Josh Hinkle here with Kelly Wiley and Arezow Doost from our investigative team. Thanks for being with us again, everyone.
Yes, thank you for having us again.
Okay, so before the break, we talked to Kelly all about how immigration enforcement was impacting schools here in Central Texas. We're turning now to another place that has previously been a protected space through federal policies that have recently been rescinded by the Trump administration. And Arezow, your investigation focuses on specifically Texas hospitals and an executive order from the governor late last year requiring hospital staff to ask patients if they're U.S. citizens. And recently, the Texas Health and Human Services Commission released the data they gleaned from asking that question. But before we explain what the state found, what did the governor intend when he asked this question? And it's kind of coming at the same time that President Trump is taking office again and making this increased immigration enforcement ramp up. And so it's just the convergence of two leaders and their choices with how to handle this issue.
Josh, Governor Abbott essentially wanted to know how much was being spent on care across our Texas hospitals on undocumented patients. He wanted to know what are the numbers and what are the costs associated with that. We talked to him recently about it. Listen to what he had to say.
I think there would be every reason why the state of Texas would have the right to sue the United States government because it is the United States government's responsibility to pay for any of the costs concerning illegal immigration, and Texas healthcare facilities should not bear that burden.
So I know that you and Christopher Adams, our digital data reporter, have been tracking that data, and we're expecting more data this summer and then later on throughout the year, so we'll have a more complete picture. But they did give you all a 1-month snapshot from November of 2024, and that did tell us quite a bit. What did the data show?
Well, the data was finally released because lawmakers wanted to know what kind of numbers we were looking at, especially given that they're back in session right now. And what was found in that 1-month period was that across our hospitals in Texas, at least 30,000 undocumented patient visits were made to a Texas hospital, and the cost came to nearly $119 million. Again, that was just a snapshot for November. The next set of data is due in June, on June 1st, and we expect to have it within weeks after all hospitals have submitted it. And then lawmakers and the governor will get an annual report in January 2026.
So you and Christopher will continue covering that issue. And I know that if you haven't seen Arezow and Christopher's story yet online at kxan.com/undocumented, be sure to check it out because they have a really interesting comparison with the state of Florida, which is the only other state that we've found that has done an executive order that's now law there and has had it out for a year now. So we have an entire year's worth of data there to compare it to maybe see what Texas could be facing in the future, right?
Absolutely. And the Florida data was great insight. And lawmakers tell us the numbers there were very small compared to what everyone was expecting. So it'll be interesting to see what we have in 2026.
So, based on what we know so far, what are we seeing as far as the impact of access to healthcare? You mentioned that there was silence from many clinics and hospitals. I know that it's kind of sometimes hard to read if people aren't going to a place, if they were intending to seek out that healthcare access anyway. But you're at least hearing from some groups that are saying that's what they're fearing, right?
Absolutely. It's a lot of what Kelly is reporting and hearing too, just a lot of hesitation and a lot of anxiety and fear surrounding being asked that question. So though we didn't hear back from a lot of clinics, on the record, behind the scenes, I heard from families, I heard from clinics telling me that people are afraid. And if they talk to us on the record, that may kind of out them and that might make them a target. So, a lot of what we were hearing was guidance that was being given to people. And I want you to listen to what the Texas Civil Rights Project told us.
Work to put out resources to let people know in the community that they have a right to decline to answer this question about their citizenship status.
So I know that lawmakers, as you mentioned, have been focusing on this issue, and the Florida comparison that we made earlier is interesting because that state made it a law. So, whereas Texas just has it as the governor's executive order, which means if Governor Abbott ever is out of office, then that possibility of the executive order might not even exist anymore. So hospitals might not have to do this. They've been looking at making this permanent as a law. So this data collection would continue far into the future, right?
Absolutely. That is one of the big topics this session. Lawmakers are trying to figure out if it should be law. In fact, just earlier this week, we saw an update to the legislation, to the House bill, and it was sent back to a committee, a public committee for review. So this is playing out in the session. They're asking questions about why is this question significant? Who is taking a look at this question? And what are the impacts? And we'll, of course, be monitoring and keep you posted.
This is a really interesting aspect, too, because one of Governor Abbott's sticking points on this is that he wants the federal government to pay back what Texas has spent on healthcare costs for undocumented immigrants. So while there is some cohesiveness with wanting to play ball with the federal government when it comes to immigration enforcement, you also kind of have that battle to show that Republican leaders in this state aren't putting up with it.
Absolutely. And this next set of data that will be out in June will give us an even bigger and better snapshot of what kind of numbers we're dealing with. There's been some complications in the recording of this data too, because many hospitals have mailed in their data. So the Texas Health and Human Services Commission has had to go in and manually input the numbers that they're getting. So November was just a brief snapshot, but I think we'll have a much better sense of where we stand with all of this come June.
And I know that you will continue tracking this with Christopher, and Christopher will also be working with Kelly on all of the education aspect of this immigration enforcement that's happening here in Texas. Thank you both for being with us, and thank you for being part of this project. It was a big one for our team, but I'm glad that we were able to tell these stories.
Me too. No, it was a really interesting experience getting to tell all these stories and also learn from each of the reporters that were working on these separate angles.
All right. Well, for those of you who have been listening or watching, we appreciate you. Don't forget, next Friday at 10:30 for Inside the Investigation. You can join us again. You can also listen to KXAN's investigative podcast, highlighting some of our award-winning team's latest reports exposing corruption, safety concerns, and system failures across Texas. The podcast will feature audio versions of our weekly Inside the Investigation discussion with the journalist working on those stories. We will see you next time.